Brazilian airports are pretty crowded nowadays. There's a couple of reasons for that. The upper middle class Brazilians are all heading north to Miami to do their shopping with the very high exchange rate, and they don't want to pay notoriously high Brazilian prices back home. Meanwhile, all their maids and domestic servants with a high exchange rate are moving south to Buenos Aires to also shop at much lower Argentine prices than they could get back in Brazil. And I wrote about this episode recently in my piece on Buenos Aires, Don't Buy From Me, Argentina. Brazil's an interesting economy at the moment. Brazil used to always be crisis-ridden, but it's actually had a good global financial crisis, a good GFC. In 2010, Brazil had an economic growth rate of 7.5%. It's now slowed somewhat to average growth rates at 2.7, but generally Brazil has been a very, very good story in recent years. One reason for this has been the election in 2002 of Lula, the metalworkers candidate who was actually jailed under the military regime in the 1980s. When Lula came to power in 2002, Brazil had the history of hyperinflation, of sluggish growth, and it was one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of income distribution. At the end of Lula's term in 2010, not only did he leave office with an 80% approval rating, but he also managed to get Brazil to a position where it was growing strongly, had low inflation, a very low unemployment rate, and Lula's anti-poverty policies had lifted 31 million people out of poverty, which is the population thereabouts of Argentina. In fact, when you look at the poverty statistics in Brazil, 15% of people are now very poor. Just 8 years ago, a quarter of the country were in that state of economic poverty. It's interesting how Lula did it. Partly it was the Bolsa Familia policies, which meant direct cash payments to poor families, a strong emphasis on education attainment and improving human capital, and also bringing in various anti-crime measures in the favelas, in the slums of Brazil, whereby the local communities looked after anti-crime measures themselves, which managed to ensure that there was less crime on the streets of the favelas. As a result, Lula left office with a very high approval rating, and he passed on to his successor, Dilma, Brazil's first female president, who's continued the very strong economic policies of Brazil and also continued the Bolsa Familia policies of Lula and the Social Democrat predecessors to ensure that Brazil improves its income distribution. Now, the new Brazil actually has been good news for Australia. Like Australia, Brazil has benefited from China's growth, the bamboo shoots of China's stimulus package. It also means that Brazil has been able to basically give to the poor without taking from the rich, a very good position to be in. For Australia, Brazil's new improved income distribution and return to strong economic growth has been good news. The growth of the middle class in Brazil has opened up opportunities for Westfield in their new shopping centres in Porto Alegre in the south to take advantage of Brazil's new consumption class. Brazil traditionally has had a low savings rate because of past experiences with hyperinflation means they have a tendency to spend. Hence you've seen not only the moves out of Brazil but also within the shopping centres within Brazil itself that Westfield is now setting up in a joint venture. Secondly, in education, Brazil's new emphasis on education has improved the opportunities for Australia's universities. When I was in Sao Paulo, I represented the University of New South Wales together with the group of 8 universities that want to do more collaboration in research and also in terms of student attraction in Latin America, particularly in Brazil. There's now 16,000 Brazilian students in Australia. They're the top source of students in South America, along with Chile and Colombia, and they're making Australian campuses very much more attractive and lively places to be, and we'll probably see more growth in the education sector. And finally, Brazil has put a lot of emphasis on clean energy and attacking climate change. Like Australia, a very vast nation with a lot of resource exports in the commodity sector, so they have to manage climate change very effectively. Pacific Hydro, which is owned by the industry funds in Australia, has a strong presence in Brazil, and Brazil increasingly is looking at wind as well as water conservation and other forms of clean energy to ensure that it continue to grow its economy, grow its prosperity and deal with some of the changes with respect to climate change. But certainly there's a lot to do now with Brazil. It has the double treat of the World Cup for soccer, for football, in 2014, and just 2 years later Rio will host the Olympic Games. So Brazil's got a lot to do in terms of infrastructure, in terms of airports, in terms of railways, and in terms of its own tourism facilities, and I was actually in Rio assisting the Rio authorities on staging the Olympic Games there in Rio. Now, airports matter, as I said in the beginning, and when I left Rio de Janeiro, I had an interesting experience with airport security. As you know, when you go through airports around the world, you're often asked to provide your laptop or take off various items of your clothing. I said to the young Brazilian woman who was a security guard, "Do I have to take off my belt?" And she said, "Yes, and you've got to take off your pants too." But before I had to unfortunately act, she laughed and said, "No, I'm just joking." I think with Brazil, if they can laugh in airport security and they can smile at the same time, I think they've got a lot of reasons to be smiling and laughing in the years ahead, particularly with the World Cup and the Olympics, meaning that many more of the world's economies will be going nuts for Brazil, just like Australia.